Let's talk about range stitching now. This is one of my favorite features inside of AVP because it's so powerful but it's still very, very simple to use. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove all these different stitch keyframing setups and all that. So we basically have our stitch calculated off of one position now. So there's one area where the stitch is perfect, and then it just holds those values and those algorithms or whatever to stitch all those cameras together, and basically just keeps it going through the whole way. So this is a great method, a fast method for a static shot, for instance, where there's really only one position in Z space that you're walking around in, so you don't need to do a range stitch or an adaptive stitch because the camera's not moving. But if you're walking like this shot, where I'm walking through a crowd here, both adaptive stitching and range stitching can come in handy in both in many different scenarios. So for this one, I'm gonna say I wanna use maybe from this point to this point. And I'll bring in my current selection area with the F key there. So you can see that I'm gonna lower the resolution here so it plays back a little bit quicker. You can see that if we go back to our in point here, basically this shot is me walking from that area for about 30 seconds or so and ending up kind of in this region. So that's all great. So basically I've got about 30 seconds of video here. And with adaptive stitching, like I talked in the last tutorial, I could basically create a keyframe at the beginning here, stitch for that area, create a keyframe back here, stitch for that area, and then go in the middle, and then the middle and middle, and middle. And I could go that for all day, forever, and kind of take all this time really adapting and kind of changing things the way I want. And that sometimes is preferable because you get, really finite control over which areas you're stitching for. But something called range stitching is pretty much the same thing, and it's very, very powerful, very, very easy to use. Basically with range stitching, what it's gonna do is it's gonna look at this current selection here, this blue bar. And when you select current selection here, stitch at current selection, you can then tell AutoPano Video how many positions to use within this blue section to stitch to. So 5, for instance, would equally spread out 5 different positions along this timeline and would stitch as best as it could along those lines and make a master stitch, kind of averaging out all those values. So it wouldn't do any keyframing like adaptive stitching would, but it's great for shots like this where there isn't really huge changes in geometry of the environment you're in, but there are subtle ones that might help to take into consideration when you're generating the overall stitch. So with current selection stitching, it's a really valuable way, really fast way to get a really powerful, generally accurate stitch. And for the most part, you're not going to be sticking on one shot for too long unless you're doing like a one-shot kind of thing. So current selection or range stitching is very, very powerful in a lot of ways. So I'm actually going to up this to like 12 or something, just to give AutoPano Video a lot of positions to look at to generate a really accurate stitch. So it's going to be really cool. So let's go ahead and do this now. So as long as current selection is selected and you have the number of positions to use added to what you want, you can go ahead and hit stitch. And this will obviously take longer because it's basically doing a current position stitch 12 times. But it isn't that much longer. It isn't necessarily 12 times longer than whatever it would take to do one current position, because it does go through pretty quickly and process all this information. But you'll see that the results are pretty great, and you get a really solid, really locked in stitch to be able to then use for any kind of other refining, or maybe even for a final export if it's good enough. All right, so it did a little bit of adjusting there. The stitch looks fine by me, and I think it would be great to take in and do further optimization. We can, of course, do a quick color fix here, just to kind of balance it out a little bit. And we have ourselves a really great looking shot. Go ahead and up the resolution so we can see all those little fine details. But you can see that there really aren't any seams or anything that we need to worry about. If we hit play, it's going to play back slow, obviously, with the resolutions it's set at. And we have some issues with the flag here that we can fix with some advanced techniques. But for the most part, the stitch is looking pretty great. So that's what range stitching is good for. Range stitching is also extremely useful if, for instance, you have a shot that you're doing underwater where you'll need to gather data from multiple points in time throughout your clip in order to get a solid stitch. If you're doing it on current position, sometimes underwater footage, everything is blue. There's not a lot of like contrasty details for AVP to latch onto, so it's hard for it to get an accurate stitch. And usually you either have to do like a template or manually set it up in APG, which can be pretty time consuming and complex. But with current selection, it's another way where you can say, hey, I want you to look at actually 12 different spots during this clip, during this selection here, and I want you to average out all those values and figure all that out so that I can get a more accurate stitch. So it's really a good way to get accuracy when there isn't a lot of information or contrast in every single frame of your video. This video is not a good example of that because clearly there's plenty of detail for AVP to latch onto to stitch with. But if you are in a I don't know, like a desert or underwater or in a snowscape or something like that, those would be good times that current selection and choosing how many ever positions you think it would take in order to get an accurate stitch. Those would be great times to use the range stitching feature.